Harsh, Shani, Nitya, Lavanya, Manan,
Yes, ma'am.
Neelakandan, Moy,
Yes, ma'am.
Pallavi,
Yes, ma'am.
Pallavi Kanna, Pallavi Panigrahi, Parul, Pooja, Prachi, Prakash, Pratik, Dubey, Radhika, Madhvi, Sagun, Sahaj, Sakhi,
Yes, ma'am.
Sakshi, Samhita, Sarthak, Sarvari, Ramya, Shivani, Shraddha, Shruti,
Yes, ma'am.
Simran, Samrit, Sonali, Selection, Sushri, Riti, Tarun, Trisha, Vanshaj, Varnika, Vishwajit, Yashna, Sonali, Animesh, Dhruv, Ashankan, John, Anshika, Ruksha, Ashwini, Garima, Akshay, Jasmine, Shreyas, Tenzil, Ashta, Abhilasha, Aishwarya, Anirudh, Gautam, Lalit, Lavanya, Meghna, Revati, Sikandar, Neha, Manu, Galton, Anumeha, why is your name written there?
Had gone on an internship for 6 months. The name I just added in the end of this. I don't think he requires attendance, but in the sense it's not mandatory. I've added it just in case because it's there in the last register.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think the seats still need to be filled up. Currently, some laws charges for attendance, not late comers. Attendance, I think they charge students. These private ones. Something like that. They have a fee. Or maybe even for late coming, I don't know.
I bet if you
So you guys got that Excel sheet on the slides or the illustrations relating to
the current threat of being attendance
the partner's salary and the house rental allowance, right? That's what somebody had asked. Then, what else? Yeah, so I think in the last class I was just trying to sketch something with a well-run on professional consultancy and marketing agency agreements. I don't know, yeah, this is the best. Yeah. So let me again try and summarize what we were looking at in the last class, and then I'll also look at Prabhodayal's case once again and just mention what it is about, because I think might help if I again repeat the conclusions in that case. Because in discussing, we may not have looked at the conclusion of the action and ordered by. So what I said is that when you are considering business income, your first task will be to ensure that it is in fact a revenue receipt, because if it's not a revenue receipt and it's a capital receipt, it escapes taxation because capital receipt is not income. So our basic task is to distinguish between capital receipts and revenue receipts, also known as source of income slash income. But merely having a bland term like source of income and income, while useful initially to understand what the concept is, doesn't really help us when we start getting into various kinds of situations. Which is why we developed a couple of tests. One relating to tangible assets. Yeah. So in the case of tangible assets, we apply the first or primary test, which is to see if there was an intention to resell. Now, if this doesn't help us, then we apply the subsidiary tests, which are seeing what the holding period is, magnitude of the transaction involved, a line of business, whether the associate is selling that asset in his own line of business. The property dealer sells property and claims it's a capital receipt and not in his line of business. That would be rather difficult to accept. A frequency or number of transactions. If it's a straight sale, then that's one thing. But if you keep on doing the same thing again and again, you are going to be it's going to be very difficult to convince someone that you're not doing business. How much you leverage, how much money you borrow is also one factor, though it's not determinative, because I could borrow money for my house which I'm buying as an investment. So in all cases, it's not a clear-cut test. And then also some people suggest that if you're maintaining professional books, that's also something which can be considered, because if you're doing it as an ad hoc stray activity, you're not going to sit and maintain books. So in the case of a land, we looked at that Rani Ratnesh Kumari's case, where some of these tests were applied to determine whether Rani Ratnesh Kumari was dealing in property or whether she was just making it as an investment, and the court concluded, applying all of these tests, that she was in fact dealing in property. The second situation which we considered is in the case of where a capital asset is clubbed with what is normally a trading or a revenue asset. So this was the case of Rajputana Textiles Limited, where in order to get a managing agency agreement, these guys had to purchase some shares, and unfortunately for them, the court held that regardless of whether it was clubbed with a trading asset or not, the fact that you had an intention to resell when you purchased the shares indicated that it would be treated as trading assets. However, there I think it is possible to have a different view as well, because in previous cases, when a similar situation had occurred, the courts had held that the shares which were purchased were not capital assets but trading assets. The third kind of situation is when you have rights under a contract.
Yeah.
And this is when we considered Prabhudayal's case. Because Prabhudayal had been promised a certain percentage of profits in consideration for the services which he had rendered in terms of locating the minerals and securing a concession agreement from the state of Sindh. However, so in that case, what the court did was, first it knocked down the business argument by saying that it was a stray activity of Prabhudayal and it was not in his line of business. But then to actually classify it as a capital asset, what the court said is that this concession agreement which Prabhudayal had entered into was actually in fact a share in the business, and it was not just a payment for services received. So that was a crucial test which the court applied to come to the conclusion it was a capital asset in Prabhudayal's case. It was not just a straightforward payment for services which were rendered, but it was actually a share in the business. So since it was a share in the business, it was a capital asset. And once you reach and the other important thing in Prabhudayal's case was it was not merely a capital asset or a share in the business. That share in the business was actually extinguished when the compromise decree was arrived at. So it was a fact of a capital asset plus the extinction of the capital asset on termination of the contract, which led to a conclusion it was a capital receipt. If the value of the capital asset, if it was just like, suppose Prabhudayal was being promised a percentage of the profits, if he had been promised a piece of land, it would have been a capital asset. But suppose the agreement had been terminated and he had not been given that land, and instead he had been given equivalent value, then there wouldn't have been a problem if he had been given cash. But in this situation, the only thing he had a right to was the percentage share in profits, and once that right was extinguished, he lost an asset. A percentage share in profits was a capital asset. Extinction of that capital asset resulted in what he received being a capital receipt. And the fourth situation is the case of employment agreements versus consultancy agreements. So without going into authorities, what we saw was, in this situation, an employment agreement when terminated, any payments received consequent to termination of an employment agreement would again be a capital receipt. Whereas in the case of a consultancy agreement, it would not be. And the rationale for that was that, on the one hand, the termination of an employment agreement affects the normal course of business, so to speak, of that employee, whereas the termination of a consultancy agreement does not affect the normal course of business of the consultant. And the second reason being that in the normal course of business, you don't usually terminate your employment agreement, whereas in the consultancy, it is possible that you terminate your agreement, or the client terminates your agreement, and still the business as such is valid. Because of these two aspects of a capital asset, namely that it is not terminated in the normal course of business, and B, even if it is terminated, it does not affect the basis of the business. Because of these two reasons, we concluded that termination of an employment agreement would result in a capital receipt, whereas termination of a consultancy agreement would not result in a capital receipt. That's why normally under English law, this is referred to as contract for services. Notice the plural. Whereas an employment agreement is normally referred to as a contract of service, which is the singular. Because it is the agreement which the employee has, termination of which, that's the whole basis of his business, so to speak. What you should notice that in spite of this being a capital receipt under the general principles of law, because of explanation to section 17(3). This has also been held to modified. This general principle of law has been modified by the Income Tax Act, and it has been provided that will be treated as part of your salary. So because of this principle of law, they had to introduce a specific explanation in the Act to convert this capital receipt into salary, which is a taxable receipt. Capital receipt is not normally taxable. They wanted to tax this kind of a receipt. So in order to tax it, they introduced a specific provision in the Income Tax Act, and they said this would be treated as salary, or in other words, so just to reiterate the finding in Prabhudayal's case, I think I already mentioned it now. What essentially we are saying is, when you have a contract, there are two kinds of situations you could have. One situation is when it represents a share in profits, which is what actually happened in that case. And the second situation is, it could represent a method of carrying on business. Not just a share in profits. So it could be share in profits plus a method of carrying on business, dividing rights, liabilities, territories, so on and so forth. It's like basically let's say an example would be a joint venture agreement or a franchise agreement, where two partners come together and divide up a territory and say that in these territories you sell these products, in the other territories I'll sell those products, and you could have what is known as the congery of rights. Yeah. So CONGERI, congery of rights. So there was an English case called Vanderbergs versus Clark, where this kind of a complicated agreement was also held to be a capital asset. This was in fact the basis for Prabhudayal's case, because they said that when you have a complicated agreement like this, it's not just in the ordinary course of business. It involves determining how business should be carried out itself. It was not an agreement to sell soaps or cements or something which you are normally in the business of. It is determining whether you will do that business at all in the first place. It is determining how profits will be shared. It is determining how territories will be divided. And so it relates to what they call as the profit-making apparatus itself. So even though this contract involves only contractual rights, I would therefore say it is quite well established that these rights under a contract would constitute a capital asset, and any termination of those rights would therefore be an extinction of that capital asset and would therefore be a capital receipt. Whereas contrast this with an ordinary consultancy agreement or a payment for services. So an ordinary consultancy agreement or a payment for services would normally be treated as therefore a trading asset. Right? So actually there's an interesting implication of this case, which is why I thought it worth to mention it again. When you're saying contractual rights themselves constitute a capital asset, in Vodafone what happened is that the situation was that someone wanted to purchase managing rights. In essence, they wanted to purchase a controlling interest in Hutchison SR. However, the court held that even though, the question was whether the purchase of those controlling rights in Hutchison SR would constitute a capital asset. If you apply all of these tests, do you think that an agreement, or there was a complicated series of agreements where shares were purchased, along with the shares, the controlling rights were also purchased in that company? So, and also remember RTL's case, where there was no question at all raised about a managing agency being a capital asset. It was only a question of managing agency plus certain shares, and the question was only whether those shares were a capital asset or not. No one ever raised a question as to whether a managing agency per se would be a capital asset. It was assumed that a managing agency is a capital asset. In the Vodafone case also a similar situation occurred. So Vodafone wanted to purchase Hutchison SR's shares in that company, and that is why they entered into that convoluted series of transactions where they acquired the parent company and therefore got a right to control the subsidiary company in India. So keeping all of this in mind, but no shares were actually transferred within India. All the shares were transferred outside India. But essentially there was a contract, and those contractual rights gave them the ability to control the activities of the downstream company as well. And that contract affected an Indian company. Those contractual rights therefore could have said to have arisen in India. They didn't arise in Mauritius, Cayman or the Netherlands. I mean the rights flowed down to the Indian company as well. So it was clear it was a right to control the Indian company's activities. So applying these tests, would you conclude that those contractual rights would constitute a capital asset? But unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, however, what the Supreme Court decided in that case is they drew a distinction between a contractual right and a property right. And they said that these are mere contractual rights and they are linked to the shares. The shares were transferred outside India, and so therefore the transfer took place outside India. A contractual right cannot have an existence apart from the shares themselves. And so they held there was no capital asset in the form of contractual rights or controlling interest, and therefore there was no transfer. So in order to overcome the effect of this decision, because I think it was quite plausible for someone looking at these kind of decisions, looking at RTL, looking at Prabhudayal's case, looking at Vanderberg versus Clark, someone could conclude that a right to control a company in itself is a valuable right, which is a capital asset, which could be purchased separately and which would be treated as a capital asset. But since the court held that no, we need to make a distinction between these two cases, the Act was again amended, and the definition of capital asset, I think it's in 247, right? So the definition of capital asset, an explanation was inserted to say that any acquisition of controlling, managing rights in a company would also be deemed to be a capital asset. So at least this part of the Vodafone judgment, which made this retrospective, which is the understanding of a capital asset, I don't think that can be assailed, regardless of what other portions of, there are a plethora of amendments which were made in Vodafone, not just to the definition of capital asset, but to certain other aspects also. So while everyone has been crying, foul about these other amendments which have been made, on which I express no comments, this portion I think is not that objectionable, because it was always understood and it was quite clear that they could be construed as a capital asset. So in that kind of a situation, making an amendment retrospective, I don't think is that objectionable. Yeah. So, but remember this whole thing of capital, a contractual right as a payment for services. I think you guys would probably you did have some difficulty in the last class, understanding the distinction, and there could be situations where the line is very thin. So which is why I am again emphasizing what you should keep in mind is that there should not just be a right, but it should also be extinguished in order to constitute a capital receipt. If this right is not extinguished, then there is no capital receipt. So let me give an illustration. See, let's take Prabhudayal's case itself. So you have a person who is rendering a service. Okay, and in return, he is paid some money by the person who receives the service. Now this money can be in the form of a lump sum payment, or as we have seen in Prabhudayal's case, it can be a percentage of the profits. And here, we have decided that there is no problem if for some reason Y defaults. As a consequence of the default, this right is lost. Then this would be treated as a capital asset. But consider a similar situation. Yeah? Where instead of a service being rendered, X gives a IP right. So it could be a right to a software, a piece of software. It could be a right to a molecule, a biological molecule, whatever. Some kind of IP, and he either leases it or licenses it to Y. Now again, for the same commercial reasons which we discussed, because for example, Y may not know what is the commercial potential of this particular molecule or this particular piece of software. So he might either pay a lump sum amount, or if its potential is clear, he will calculate what is the benefit that he is going to receive, and he will pay the appropriate amount to X. Or he could decide to say, let's try it out, and you take a share in the profits. In this kind of situation, if there is a default by Y, then I would say it's a revenue receipt. Can you tell me why? It's almost identical. Both cases you have a lump sum payment versus a percentage of profits. Both cases X is giving something to Y, and there is a default by Y in giving the lump sum payment or the share of profits. But in one case it would be a capital asset, in the other case a revenue receipt. Y. That is, I am assuming X goes and he manages to claim damages. In both cases X will have to go and claim damages. right? So the question is, how do you characterize the damages which are received when these are denied and he gets damages in return? In one case I say it would be a capital asset, in the other case a revenue receipt. Why? What distinguishes these two cases? The answer is already on the board.
Maybe the fact that when he leases or licenses it, he's not losing his, as in if it gets terminated, he's not losing the ability to lease or license it to someone else.
Why?
Because
So Zaki is saying the answer is because he doesn't lose the ability to leave or license it to someone. So I have two questions then. One, why doesn't he lose the right to leave or license it to someone else? And two, why should it make a difference? Okay, I'll answer the first question. The reason why he can lease or license it to someone else again is because usually under the terms of your license or lease, you say that if there is a default in payment, then you lose those rights. I am entitled to terminate this agreement. If you don't have a termination clause, then you don't actually get a right to terminate the agreement. That is a lesser known fact. The reason or the importance of a termination clause in a contract is, in certain situations, if you don't have a termination clause, then you rely under the general principles of contract law, and the general principles of contract law say that you only have a right to claim damages, because then they determine whether it is something which is going to the root of the contract or something which is just an incidental condition. And if it goes to the root of the contract, you have a right to terminate under law. If it doesn't go to the root of the contract, then you can only sue for damages, but you should, how much ever you may dislike wife, still continue to do business with him, which is why especially in IP contracts it's very important to have this innocuous clause called as a termination clause. So when you have a termination clause, what it does is it cuts off Y's right to use that asset anymore. So then what happens? Why does it make what you receive then a revenue receipt and not a capital receipt? Yeah? Because in that situation, your right is not extinguished, right, in the asset. You get the IP back, he stops using the IP, he no longer has a right to use the IP, you get the IP back. Once you get the IP back, where's the question of you're having lost something? So what will be the quantum of damages in that kind of a situation? Will you be compensated for a loss of the IP asset, or would you be compensated for not being paid what you were promised, or why not performing his part of the contract? What will be the basis or measure of compensation? Second one, right? The measure of damages will be in this situation not for loss of the IP asset, but it will be simply a function of how much you lose because the contract was not performed as promised.